Yo, Shalom, we back. SUC in the building. You know how we rocking, man. This is the finale of the book, Black Jews in Africa and the Americas by Tudor Parfitt. You know, we're under the Fair Use Act, so we will be giving commentary, criticisms, and using this for scholarship and research purposes and teaching purposes. So we're well within our right to review this material. Shalom, second Exodus, brother. Shalom, second Exodus, brother. Appreciate that, man. I try to put in that work, man, because we got a lot of naysayers out there that mention books, they mention certain works, and they don't take out the time to actually dive into these works, read these works, disseminate the information. Hey, Shalom, Plumantis, my brother Shalom. Shalom, man. I know you're a strong supporter of the channel, a strong supporter of what the source got going on and the information that we're disseminating here, man. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate all brothers and sisters that come to the channel, but especially Plumantis, because he show love every day. Hey, appreciate the second Exodus, man. Anything y'all can do, share it on social media platforms, get these videos out there, because this is a dime a dozen, man. Name me another channel that's actually going to go through and disseminate an entire book. I don't know of any, but if there is one that exists, let me know and I'll go check them out. I love information. You understand? You know what I'm saying? I appreciate all you brothers. Shalom to Scott Garrett Headley. Shalom. Appreciate you for coming through and showing your support. All right. So, yeah, man, let's get it. Y'all know how we get down. We're going to open up with my brother, LV Europa. You know what I'm saying? I pretty much let him dominate the intros and outros of the whole breakdown of the Black Jews in Africa and the Americans by Tudor Parfitt. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's what the saying is. So without further ado, let's get into LV. And after the intro plays, I will read the Fair Use Act to protect this video and this content because we are looking into copywritten information. But under the Fair Use Act, we are allowed to use it for teaching and research purposes. All right. So let's get into it. Start the night all right with my brother LV Roper spitting flames, splitting dope, man. Fire bars. Let's go.
I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of the meter, I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up in my leisure, I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper, I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of the meter, I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up in my leisure, I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper. This is a keepsake, hey. And you can keep that tucked away. Some gon' come with the lies. Remember them when you pray. Some gon' cry when they die. You don't worry about the cave. Look, I done went away. My time is short, so I'ma live it today. That shit was real. I had to tell them slaves. Hey, but you gotta be brave. It's a land of the free. Gotta move like ways. Hey, put the ring to the pad. Hey, I give them path for the rage. Then I put them on the path to take them all up the stage. I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of the demeanor, I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up in my leisure, I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper, I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. Heat up in my leisure, I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper. This is a keepsake, hey. You can use this right away. Some gon' come with the truth. Honor them when you pray. Some gon' laugh about their life. They don't worry about delays. Look, I done whipped up away that level's real when you can use it today. Don't worry about how you're gonna get paid. Lord, give it free, take it away, hey. Don't you wanna be free? Remove that rage. There's a path to the light, hey. Don't misuse those ways. We flow with the truth. Gotta move like waves. I got a visa, that's one swipe. The change of demeanor, I got that all money, That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. I heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You know I'm a keeper, I got a visa. That's one swipe, the change of demeanor. I got that all money, baby. That bitch came with a beeper, cold as a freezer. I heat up in my leisure. I feel like a fever, baby. You should know that I'm a keeper.
All right. Y'all know the drill. Y'all know the deal. We back at it, man. Let's go. We back at it. Source gang over everything. 7 gang, source gang over everything. Before I get started reading the copyright thing, I'm going to give a couple shout outs. Shout out to the CEO, Jeremiah. Please say the Yah. Put some respect on his name. Shout out to my brother James Cassell, man, slinging and banging from the land of Canaan. Shout out to my brother D Red, the blue collar scholar. Shout out to my sister Diamond that's dropping them jewels. And shout out to my number one shot of the Dun Bird Pro Rizzo. You feel me? And then shout out Tanks on the Ground, General Yashar, you know what I'm saying? Shout out to the middleweight champion, King Self, Gold Coast Gorillas. You know what I'm saying? Shout out to Elder Yara, Hebrew Intelligentsia, Anonymous Hebrew, Orthodox Moor, and shout out to Sister E. We see you putting in work. We appreciate what you guys bring to the table. All right, so now before we get into this book, as you guys should be accustomed to, I always read the Fair Use Act. All right. So, Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides the statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of usage, such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. So, we're going to be doing all that tonight, man. You understand? We're going to be doing a little bit of all that, primarily scholarship and research and teaching. So, with that being stated, no further ado, we are at the finale. This is the end of Tudor Parfitt's book, and I believe he ended this book with a banger, man. You know what I'm saying? Tudor Parfitt ended this book right. Like, he ended this with some bombs. You know what I'm saying? We're going to have to get a bomb drop for the end of this book, man. This is an amazing way to wrap up what he said. And that's why I tell people, you know, if you ain't reading books in its entirety, then how can you have a complete thought or judgment on the book? How? That's what I want to know. How can you have a complete judgment or thought on the book? You don't even know what the book is talking about. You just skimmed a couple pages. Now you want to act as if you're the expert of the damn book. No, you're not. You see us knocking at the door. Let the readers in. But man, the man finished this book with a bomb, man, with a banger. Oh, we're gonna dive into it tonight. We're gonna dive into it, man. We're gonna dive into it. All right, let's get into it, man. Share my screen so you guys can see. And yeah, man, we push education over here at the source, man. We go straight to the source, unlike the other guys. We put it like that. Unlike the other guys, man. The other guys ain't dedicated like this, man. That's why we call them dilettantes. And for some reason, it does not want to share the screen. 1 minute, y'all. Give me a moment. Get this thing popping and rocking and rolling, man. All right, let's do it again. Share my screen. There we go. There we go. All right, you guys should see it. I'm going to expand it so the words will be big. And you guys don't have to squint at your screen. All right, there we go. All right. You all should be able to see that now. Black Jews in Africa and the Americas by Tudor Parfitt, Chapter 9. History, Genetics, and Indigenous Black African Jews. Now, you know I love the field of genetics. I actually want to apply to a university and get my master's in it, So this chapter hit home for me for various reasons. And it might not be obvious to some, especially those that oppose us, right? But we're going to get into it and see how he ended this book. Like I said, a banger, fire chapter. So let's get right into it. Black Judaism developed as a radical alternative to other identities in a partly religious, partly racial frontier zone between black and white, master and slave, colonizer and colonized. And in the case of the Beta Israel Ethiopian, a partly religious, partly tribal frontier zone between them and their Amhara Christian neighbors, and later their white Jewish visitors. Israelites' origins for certain groups in Africa were constructed by white colonists and travelers, but not with the intention that the constructed group should ever start practicing Judaism. The subsequent adoption of blacks of racial Israelite identities and religions, both in Africa and the United States, was a subversive way of shedding racial identity that was sullied by slavery, segregation, and colonial oppression. So again, that we mentioned in the last chapter, why would anybody want to be attached to an identity that was attached to slavery, segregation, and colonial oppression? You understand? They will tell you that you're black means you don't have any history, that you're primitive, and you deserve to be subjugated, and you're inferior naturally. That's what was being attached with that word black. You understand? So many people would run away from that term naturally. That's all Tudor Parfitt is pointing out. The renunciation of Christ in strongly Christian societies was subversive. The renunciation of race at a time when racial identities were of a paramount importance was also subversive. Yet the subversive act may have harbored seeds of doubt and self-interrogation. There was perhaps even in their own eyes a certain motleyiness or uncertainty in the composite ethnic identity embraced by many Black, Jewish, and Israelite communities, both in the United States and in Africa, which was heightened by the reluctance of white Jews and other Black and white observers to accept their version of sacred and racial history. It is for this reason that proofs of their adopted history and identity were and are so hungrily and enthusiastically seized upon. The main historical proofs, outside the frequently cited biblical proof texts suggesting the inclusion of Black Africans in early Israelite sacred history, lay in the fact that there were already supposed to be some authentic, verified indigenous Black Jewish communities in the world who were in direct descent from the Hebrew patriarchs. Many Black, Jewish, and Israelite communities cite one or other of these groups to demonstrate that there is nothing impossibly quixotic about the idea of being Black and Jewish. Others claim descent from or kinship with such groups. Now, this is a key point of this chapter, using these certain groups as reference frames to claim Jewish descent. When I talk about Judaism, we're talking about a Jewish descent, descending from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's keep reading. He says, others claim descent from kinship with such groups. The indigenous Black Jewish communities with this ancient pedigree that were and are most regularly invoked in the vindication of Black Jews and Black Israelites claims are the mixed Black Jewish communities that existed along the west coast of Africa and other West African groups. The Beta Israel, Falasha community in Ethiopia, which now is to be found almost entirely in its entirety in Israel, and more recently the Limba community of Southern Africa. The websites of many of the Black Jewish movements throughout the world still invoke one or more of these proof communities. The website of Moorish Biafran Temple of Israelites, for instance, notes the growing evidence that the people of the ancient biblical world were an African people. Today, many people of African descent around the world practice Judaism and trace their lineage to ancient times. For example, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia believes that they are descendants of Menelik, son of Solomon, and the Limba tribe of South Africa believes that they are the descendants of the tribe of Levi. In 2002, following the genetic tests on the Limba, which were widely reported by the media, and construed as proven that the Limba were of Jewish origin. The minister Shalom Hebrew Israelite Congregation of Jackson, Mississippi, Reverend Herman Taylor, wrote to me expressing his satisfaction that the scientific proof recently provided of Limba's Jewish origins has so fundamentally proven his own Black Jewish group's kinship with Israelite populations in Ethiopia, Rwanda, Burundi, the Sudan, Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, and Malawi. Now, why is that important? Because many people focus at the fact that these Bantus, these Limba have the J haplogroup, which is true. The Rimba amongst them have it. But you also got to understand the rest of the Limba are quote unquote Bantu or EM2. That will connect majority of African Americans, about 60% of us, right? 50-60%, somewhere around there, to the Bantu. So people were looking at that as a genetic link. It's going to be touched on. Descriptions in the burgeoning travel and missionary literature of Jews or descendants of Jews living along the western coast of Africa were available in the libraries of the United States and Europe from the mid-17th century. And by the end of the 18th century, some Black intellectuals in Europe and the United States undoubtedly knew of them. The supposed substantial presence of Jews in West Africa took on particular importance in the development of Black Jewish movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. Not least because there was verifiable kernel of the fact supported by this distinguished literature to which they could attach their aspirations and beliefs. In the United States particularly, the west coast of Africa was imagined as an important locus of Black Jews, including misplaced phylacteries. Descriptions of Black Jews living in West Africa go back to John O. Gilby, 1600 to 1676. The English translator and publisher whose works range from translations of Homer to his famous series of books on geography. He noted of the coast of Guinea, many Jews also are scattered over this region. Some natives boasting themselves of Abraham's seed, inhabiting both sides of the river Niger. Others are Asian strangers who fled hither either from the desolation of Jerusalem by Vespasian or from Judea wasted and depopulated by Romans, Persians, Saracens, and Christians. Similarly, there are scattered references to Black Jews in Portuguese territories in West Africa. Frederick Ratsell described them as Mavumba, renowned as potters and smiths to whom some assign a Jewish origin. Jews expelled from Portugal being alleged to have settled at Sao Tome and to have sent a branch this way. In Sao Tome and neighboring Principe, islands about 150 miles off the northwestern coast of Gabon, there were indeed well-attested communities of people of part Jewish descent who originally expelled from Portugal in considerable numbers, following the forced expulsion of Jews from Portugal in 1497. In 1601, the Portuguese crown gave orders permitting Jewish merchants based on mainly Cape Verde Island to settle and trade along the Senegambia and Upper Guyanian coast. So with that being said, this is my commentary. No one can ever say that there were no Jews in West Africa, because we know for a fact that these Sephardim and their descendants lived on the coast of Guinea and Senegambia and Principe, Sao Tome, Cape Verde, and so on and so forth. We know that for a fact. To anybody pushing that nonsensical BS that there were no Jews in West Africa, they are being ahistorical. A meaning against, or not. They're not being historical. A meaning not, or no, or against. All right, so let's keep reading. It says, soon Jews were working as trade factors along the coast and even in the interior among the Wolof and other African communities. They traded for slaves, wax, gum, ivory, and gold. In Senegambia, a number of conversos forced Jewish converts to Christianity, took advantage of the distance from Portugal to return publicly to their ancestral faith. At Portugal, south of Dakar, in 1606, a certain Father Bellaria observed a village of 100 Portuguese who followed the laws of Moses. From the beginning of the 17th century, these Jews, some of mixed Portuguese African descent, some with African wives and servants, were often engaged in the illegal import of swords. The descendants of these Jews and other Portuguese immigrants of Cape Verde Islanders and of West Africans developed a culture that was itself a synthesis of African and European elements. So let me stop right there. Many of our oppositional forces, our opponents, will say, well, how are these guys Jews? They're practicing African practices. Well, of course, they were amongst these African people, or these people that had this tradition, and they amalgamated or had a synthesis between their beliefs and the African beliefs. So just because someone practiced something, culture is not passed down through genes. People pass down culture, through oral transmission or written transmission. That's how culture is passed down, not through the act of sex and reproduction. So just because someone has a particular culture doesn't mean that they are that group or they're not that group. You understand? Anyone arguing with that, you need culture, you need anthropology, you need genetics, you need archaeology. And you need to make them mesh to make this argument solid. Greatest example of that, the Timbuktu. I bring up the Timbuktu Jews. Many of them are Muslims, but they know that they're Jews. Even though they practice a Quranic faith, they still claim that they are biologically Jews. So it has nothing to do with their culture. It's more of an argument of descent and who they are biologically. That's all it is. But for some reason, the oppositional forces that be don't want to acknowledge that. They want to make it a religious argument when it's not. At its core, it's about who we descend from at the end of the day. So anyway, the book just showed you that these people had a synthesis between the African traditions and the Jewish traditions. Let's keep going. The famous Scottish explorer Mungo Park, 1771 to 1806, described having encountered some Arabic-speaking Jews in West Africa on the left bank of the River Niger, and remarked that there were said to be many Jews in nearby Timbuktu. It might be imagined that the presence of Sephardi Jews and their African descendants along the west coast of Africa and Jews active in the trade routes to the north left some traces and influenced African religious praxis in some places. This seems to be suggested by John Leighton Wilson, 1809 to 1886, the American missionary and Bible translator from South Carolina, who observed of the northern Guinea that paganism and Judaism are united. And in southern Guinea, paganism, Judaism, and some imperfect traces of corrupted form of Christianity. So I'm going to stop. What we just read, that the African and Jewish practices became a synthesis. So this guy in the 19th century is witnessing this in southern Guinea. He's seeing that there's a convergence of Judaism and African practices. And that's what he's referring to as paganism, the African traditions. Read on. We're back in the quote. It says, in former regions of country, Judaism is more prominently developed. Some of the leading features of which are circumcision, the division of tribes into separate families, and very frequently into the number 12, the rigid interdiction of marriage between families too nearly related, bloody sacrifices with the sprinkling of blood upon their altars and doorposts, the formal and ceremonial observance of the new moon, a specific time for mourning for the dead, during which they shave their heads and wear soiled and tattered clothes, demonical possessions, purifications, and various other uses, probably of a Jewish origin, because everything he observed we can verify as being quote unquote Jewish. Shaving of the head when you're mourning, the bloody sacrifices and sprinkling the blood upon altars and doorposts, that's Jewish practices. Some of these uses, especially the rite of circumcision, might be supposed to have been of Mohammedan origin if it were not for the entire absence of all other traces of this religion among the pagan tribes of both Guineas. So he's saying, well, we can say it's Mohammedan, but we don't see anything else Mohammedan amongst these quote-unquote pagan tribes. But we do see the Judaism. We do witness that in Guinea. We can see it. And in Eda Bruder's book, she points out so eloquently that we know the Jews were in West Africa because they were able to draw Catalan maps, the Catalan Atlas, You understand? And they were geographically accurate. I think it was the 1300s in the early 14th centuries. All right, let's keep going. They was able to draw those maps, which were maps of the Western African region that included the Sahara, the Sahel, and some areas below it. First of its kind. In order for you to be able to draw these maps, you have to be well versed with the land. You have to know the land, have to know the landscape. That lets you know that they had community there. They had communication there. They understood the area in question, which is Western Sub-Saharan Africa. Let's keep going. The Jewish element of this mixed population seemed to have been swallowed up by the host society. In any event, it was not remarkably visible in 1864 when William Winwood Reed, 1838 to 1875, the Scottish explorer and historian, visited West Africa. Summarizing the history of these communities, he noted that John II of Portugal in 1484, finding the climate of Sao Tome was so unhealthy, gave the Jews in his kingdom the agreeable choice of being baptized or of colonizing Sao Tome. Great numbers were sent out and married women brought over from Angola. From this union arose a mixed race which the Portuguese firmly perpetuated. I could detect no relic of the Jewish type, which is decidedly providential. For a union of the Jew and Negro would be, commercially speaking, dangerous to Christianity. What was true for Reed in 1864 is even truer now. The Jews of the Bilad al-Sudan and western coastal areas have disappeared without leaving much of a trace, at least in Africa. Culturally, they did. But why couldn't he see this in the late 19th century? Because many of them look like the other locals. We read books on that. David Wheat produced a book on that. That these people produce children of darker and darker shades. Because they were sleeping with the women of Angola, the natives of the coast of Guinea. And these children were darker and darker. So, of course, you go up there trying to find what you call a Jew, or what you think in your mind as a Jew. You're not going to see that. You're just going to see a bunch of what we call Negroes, Africans, so on and so forth. Let's keep reading. It says, it's unlikely, however, that these practices, and again, above it says right here, the Jewish element of this mixed population seem to have been swallowed up by the host society. And that's what I just explained to you guys. But back here at the bottom paragraph, it says, it is unlikely, however, that these practices, most of which suggest Israelite rather than rabbinic Jewish practices, had anything to do with Portuguese Jews or conversos. Probably the religious practice here described were simply African. So again, like I said, this brother Tudor Parfitt is open. He has pros and cons and caveats to this argument. So he said maybe it's just African. Even though they're very similar to Jewish practices, maybe they're just African. It says the influence of these scattered Jewish communities along West African coast cannot be held responsible for the discovery by missionaries and others of people of Israelite origin, Judaic customs, and traces of Hebrew throughout the entire African continent. So he's saying just because we have these these groups, these in question that could be Jewish, it can't be all on the missionaries. You can't give all of the what's the word I'm looking for? You can't say, well, the only reason why is because all of these missionaries for every group that has Judaic traditions or cultic-like practices. Let's keep reading. It says, nor can the millions of people throughout the world who claim Israelite ancestry be understood as descending from such communities. Whether these historical communities contributed to the knowledge of American slave communities had of Judaism, which is not unlikely. Listen what he just said. Whether these historical communities contributed to the knowledge American slave communities had of Judaism, which is not unlikely. He's saying that these African groups that were carrying these Judaic practices, it is possible that these ideas of Judaism transmitted from them. That's what his book says. You Negroes didn't read it. Let me keep reading. Whether these historical communities contributed to the knowledge American slave communities had to Judaism, which is not unlikely, he says it's not unlikely that this occurred, is a topic that requires further research. At the time of writing, however, there is little to suggest that the Judaic communities or practices described by Aluda Equiano, Charles Pennington, Bata Kendai, Amgoza ibn Labogola, or Rabbi Wentworth A. Matthew, who had claimed to originate from a small Falashes village in Lagos, Nigeria, or indeed any of the movements adopting Israelite identities on either side of the Atlantic in the 19th and 20th centuries owe much of anything to these communities. So he's saying there's a paucity of evidence, but you can clearly see that he's open to the idea. Because, right, again, he said, which is not unlikely. All right. So we're at this paragraph on the right side. It says the question now is whether the two other groups in Africa that have some claim to be considered indigenous or autochthonous Black Jews, and which have been used and are being used to validate and legitimate the historical vision of much of Black Judaism, form part of the theoretical scheme outlined throughout this book. In other words, were the Beta Israel and the Limba constructed out of European myths and racialist and colonial fantasies in the same way as Igbo, Ashanti, Yoruba, Tutsi, Zulu, Maasai, and many others? Or are they authentic historical Jewish communities who may be viewed as descending from some perhaps ancient Israelite, Hebrew, or Jewish stock? For hundreds of years, Ethiopia was the locus par excellence of the Israelites in Africa myth. And until the 19th century, attempts were still being made to locate the lost tribes of Israel and around this mountainous African kingdom. Various reports filtered through to Europe concerning the existence of Jews in Ethiopia. The arrival in Rome at the end of the 15th century of a group of Ethiopian Christians who founded a monastery called San Stefano degli Apsini began to provide some reliable sounding information. Abraham Farasol from 1451 to 1525, the polemist and geographer who spent most of his life in Ferrara, commented on accounts he had heard from the Black priests who arrived and continued to arrive each day and relate in detail the reality of many Jews among them in Ethiopia. And in Rome, there is a sect made of these priests whose members is close to 30, residing in a monastery established anew for them. The Jesuit Bishop Andrew de Oviedo, who had been sent to Ethiopia by the King of Portugal, wrote in 1557 that the Jews possessed a great inaccessible mountains, and they had dispossessed the Christians of many lands which they were masters of, and that the kings of Ethiopia could not subdue them, because they have but small forces, and it is very difficult to penetrate into the fastness of their rocks. John Pori in 1572 to 1636, the English traveler, administrator, and translator of Leo Africanus' description, referred specifically to more than one independent Jewish polity in the vicinity of Ethiopia. At this day, he wrote, also the Abyssinians affirmed that upon the Nilus towards the west, there inhabited a most populous nation of this Jewish stock under a mighty king, and likewise on the north part of the kingdom of Guiome. In the southerly quarter of the kingdom of Gorham, there are certain mountains peopled with Jews who there maintain themselves free and absolute through the inaccessible situations of the same. Further information about Jews in Ethiopia was provided by the 17th century Portuguese Jesuit missionary Balthazar Teles, 1595 to 1675. In the travels of the Jesuits in Ethiopia about the Gala of Ethiopia, he observed, the most received opinion among learned men is that the people are originally descended from those Jews who, on occasion of transmigration or dispersion of the said nation under Salmanazar, Nebuchadnezzar, Titus, Adrian, and Severus, settled on the part of the borders of Ethiopia. Now, let's get out of the book real quick. He mentioned Severus. Now, we do understand under the Pax Romana, according to St. Jerome, that there were Jewish communities all the way from India to the western tip of Africa. Because under the Severan dynasty, the Jews were very prosperous. They went through an era of prosperity. So for him to mention Severus is huge because that's historically accurate. Because we did have a time of a population boom, if you will, and prosperity from India all the way to the western tip of Africa. That's recorded in St. Jerome. That's an early attestation of Jews coming through Africa and making it all the way to the western tip, by the way. And the Severian dynasty ruled in the 3rd century. So that's a source that goes all the way back to the 3rd century in the Common Era. So back into the quotation, it says, transmigration or dispersions of the said nation under Salmanazar, Nebuchadnezzar, Titus, Adrian, and Severus settled on part of the borders of Ethiopia, and that from them came those we now call Galas or Galas, which signifies milk, changing C into G, as it is frequently done in other nations. For the Abyssinians, changing Kala into Gala gave the name of those to those Jews and to other Greeks and Assyrians who mixed with them. Galas or Kalas signifying white man, for Kala in the Hebrew signifies milk, and they were called milks to denote they were white, and still these people are called the Galas, which is whites, though they are now black. End quotation. Now, I know a lot of people are like, oh, they said they were white. So, I mean, there's many ways you can look at that. But even if they were physically white, that doesn't matter to me. I did a video called Phenotypes Does Not Matter. I did a video about that, where you can be genetically related to someone, share the same male ancestors as someone, and they look completely different from you. Exhibit A, Einstein. Einstein is E3B. Many African Americans are E3A. That's our brother Clade, and he looks completely different than what we will call a typical quote-unquote Negro. And we can go down the list. Adolf Hitler's E3B. Go down the list. Blake Griffin's son is probably E3A, and his son don't look like any of us that we call a typical Negro. You know what I'm saying? He looks quote-unquote European. So again, phenotype does not matter. The modern racial theory has messed up mind up when it comes to genetic relatedness. We look at everything from the surface level and we don't deal with the genetics, which this chapter is going to deal with. Let's keep reading. Even if it meant that physically, it doesn't bother me at all, because we know genetically someone can look white, black, or whatever and still be genetically related to each other. Let me keep reading. All right. So, however, there were other Jews apart from these milks in Ethiopia besides Hero. Betwixt the emperor dominions and the Khafris dwelling near River Nile and now free from any subjection to the empire, there are still many of these Jews whom they are called Falashas, which signifies strangers, and it may be supposed they also came into Ethiopia out of the captivity of Salmanazar or afterwards, when they were expelled at the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus and Vespasian, and therefore the Abyssinians, though many were also Jews, descended from those who came from Melech, the son of the queen of Sheba, by Solomon, also always treated them as strangers, God so ordering that they should have no settled dwellings in the earth, who would not receive the King of heaven. These still have Hebrew Bibles and sing the Psalms very skillfully in their synagogues. Now, I just want to make a mention real quick about them being treated as strangers. I believe the word Falasha actually means stranger. You can fact check me on that. But years ago, we were having a discussion, me and Mikael, Hebrews in the Hood. We were discussing that. He was bringing that out. So, yeah, so it's interesting they were treated like strangers. That's probably where their name derived from. End quote. Tallis constructed the Beta Israel as a despised Jews, rejectors of Christ with no settling dwelling. By suggesting falsely that the Beta Israel in these areas, perhaps near the current border between the Sudan and Ethiopia, not only had Hebrew text, but also spoke Hebrew, but with much corruption in the words as there is in their lives and manners. Historically, the Beta Israel community had no knowledge at all of Hebrew. Now, why is Tudor Parfitt saying this? Because he knows that their language that they chose to latch on to was Ge'ez. So most of their words and most of their liturgy is written in Ge'ez. It's not written in Hebrew. It says there is no mention in any of the literature that they own or held any Hebrew text of any description. But of course, Jews elsewhere in the world had Hebrew text and knew at least some Hebrew, and therefore, in order to confirm their Jewishness or to construct their Jewishness, Tallis made the Beta Israel Hebrew speaking and provide them with Hebrew text. Certain factors that were responsible for the creation of an imagined Israelite identity in so many different parts of Africa in the world were nonetheless absent in Ethiopia. For one thing, Ethiopia was already predominantly Christian country with a long history. For another, it had a written culture. Moreover, it was not colonized until the 1930s, and then only partially and briefly. And in any case, the case of self-invention of an Israelite identity in Ethiopia had already occurred. So what he's saying here is you cannot say that the Ethiopian construct of them being Jews was a product of post-colonialism or colonialism, because they didn't have any colonialism until the 1930s. You understand? And they have a written history. They recorded the Kibra Nagas is their document, It's full of mysticism, but what do we learn about myths? Myths usually encapsulate historical realities. All right, so it says the national epic of Ethiopia celebrates the Israelite origins of the royal house, and this became the basic metaphor for legitimacy and authority within Ethiopian culture. It was even embodied in the 1955 Ethiopian constitution. The imperial dignity shall remain perpetually attached to the line which descends without interruption from the dynasty of Menelik, son of the queen of Ethiopia, the queen of Sheba, and the king Solomon of Jerusalem. For those travelers and missionaries who penetrated the kingdom, the construction of extraneous origins for some of Ethiopian people was a way of accounting for certain unexpected phenomena, such as certain customs of the Gala, as was the case elsewhere in Africa. There were, however, great differences between Ethiopia and sub-Saharan African countries. In an independent Ethiopia, the missionaries did not have the free reign they often had elsewhere. Their activity was restricted because of the suspicions of the established national church and the court. The missions were only permitted to preach to non-Christians, and the non-Christians who held out the greatest appeal at the time, when for millenarian reasons the conversion of the Jew was so ardently sought by many evangelicals, were the Beta Israel or Falashas, the so-called Ethiopian Jews. The London Society of Promoting Christianity Among the Jews commenced its activities in Ethiopia in 1860. But between 1860 and 1922, European missionaries were never active in the country for more than a few months at a time, and the work of evangelizing was done by native agents. Before the contact with Western missionaries and visiting European Jews in the 19th century, the Beta Israel had an identity that was in part constructed from Ethiopian national epic, the Kibra Nagas, and the Bible. They participated in the national myth that the first emperor of Ethiopia, Menelik, was the son of King Solomon by the Queen of Sheba. They perceived themselves as Israelites, as is the elite of Christian Ethiopia. Now, I thought that was heavy because a lot of people, a lot of apologetics, a lot of black apologetics will go back to the Ethiopian Christian Empire. But you do understand that these people were pushing the notion that they were literally Israelites. That's what these Ethiopians were pushing. And y'all try to connect to that. Then remember, in the book of Acts, you have the Ethiopian eunuch that came to Jerusalem. How did he know to come to Jerusalem? How did he know that for the feast? How did he know? Because he was keeping those customs. That's why he made his way to Jerusalem to fulfill Deuteronomy chapter 16. And that's an attestation from the first century, because that's when the alleged writings were made, right? In the first century. The book of Acts would have been composed then. And if those words be true and they recount historical accounts, then that would mean there was Ethiopian Jews all the way back then. And then if you want to go further, you can go to the book of Zephaniah 3:10 that says, the daughter of my suppliants are beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. That is attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That scripture and verse is in the Dead Sea Scroll. So we know we had people in Ethiopia and within Africa according to that alone. If those words be true in retellings of historical accounts, which I find no reason to doubt them, because we went over a few Fridays ago, maybe 2 Fridays ago, this was the last Friday. We went over archaeology of Israel, Judah, and Edom. And during that, we went over the archaeological attestation of what's written in the Bible as far as the account with Shalmaneser exporting and deporting Israelites, them fleeing into Judea, um, and other things that validate the historical account, the names of kings, the names of the city, Samaria, and so on and so forth. So I can see a historical accuracy within the historical accounts in the Bible. So why would I doubt that? All right, so back to the writing. So we have ancient historical attestation to these Ethiopians as well. It says, when James Bruce, who traveled in Ethiopia between 1769 and 1774, came across the Beta Israel, they explained that they came with Menelik from Jerusalem. So Bruce could note that they perfectly agree with the Abyssinians and the story of the Queen of Saba. From as early as the 16th century, however, Ethiopian non-Beta Israel sources began to suggest that the Beta Israel had come to Ethiopia after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE. This may reflect a Portuguese influence on local views of Beta Israel origins. By the time of Swiss Lutheran missionary Samuel Gubat, 1799 to 1879, visited the Beta Israel in 1830, there was a mixed tradition. As he put it, they do not know of what tribe they are, nor they have any adequate idea as to the period when their ancestors settled in Abyssinia. Some say that it was Menelik, the son of Solomon. Others believe they settled in Abyssinia after the destruction by the Romans. Gobat, however, was adamant that he knew who they were and where they were from. It is generally maintained by themselves, he wrote, that they came over prior to the time of Solomon and Rehoboam, but notwithstanding the prevalence of this opinion, it is probable that the migration, properly so called, did not take place until after the destruction of Jerusalem. It is well known that the Jews swayed the scepter of the dominion over Arabia and a portion of Persia for several ages previous to the appearance of Muhammad, but when the malignant star rose, they withered beneath its influence and soon bowed to the Arabian yoke. But as Christian Ethiopia resisted, the Jews who resided within her borders were screened from the powers of the destroyer and succeeded in maintaining their political constitution, and it is affirmed that they have still preserved their religion without contamination. Close quote. Their status as Black Jews became institutionalized when, perhaps at the suggestion of Joseph Wolff, the Jewish convert to Christianity. Hold on, I want to make a statement. Someone said there was no Jews that were Christians. These people follow the line of thinking that they descend directly from Israelites and they were Christians. We just read it right here to the left. This paragraph here that's highlighted in green. They perceive themselves as Israelites, as did the elites of Christian Ethiopia. So these people were Christians and claiming an Israelite lineage. So, Garfield, you were wrong about that. Dr. Reggie, I love you, brother, but you was incorrect about that. Let's keep going. The status as Black Jews became institutionalized when perhaps a suggestion of Joseph Wolff, the Jewish convert to Christianity, missionary, and fervent seeker of lost tribes, Gobat urged the London Society for Promoting of Christianity among the Jews to take over the mission to Beta Israel, which it did in 1859. That was not exactly a stampede on the part of Western Jews to go and greet their long-lost Black brethren in Ethiopia. Filoseno Lusato, 1829 to 1854, the Italian Jewish scholar, was one of the first to take an interest in the remote community when he read about them in Bruce's travels when he was a boy of 13. Subsequently, in 1845, he read in the journals Des Debats, an account of the community in a report sent in by remarkable Franco-Irish traveler and savant Anton de Adabi, who traveled in Ethiopia between 1837 and 1848. Lusato sent Ababdi a list of questions about the Beta Israel, and Ababdi's replies to the questionnaire eventually arrived in France and were published first in Archives Israelites and later in the Jewish Chronicle. Ababdi's various reports explain that the Beta Israel believed that they had arrived in Ethiopia at the time of Solomon, but that they had entertained some extraordinary notions altogether incompatible with Judaism as understood by other Jews. These notions included celibacy, ritual suicide, and clitoral excisions of girls at 8 days old, which is all not Judaism. But what I like to note is these notions included celibacy, and that was more of an Essene thing. If you read about the Essenes, some of the Essenes believe to reserve themselves to the Most High and not deal with women at all, and they would live their whole life celibate, and that's why many people believe that Jesus, John the Baptist, and Paul were followers of the Essenes, and that's why you don't hear them mentioned in a negative light or mentioned at all, because they're only speaking against the Sadducees and Pharisees in the New Testament. And when we look at the Essenes, what do? They refrain from women. That was one of their traits. You understand? And they did baptism as well. They practiced that before there was even a New Testament written, or any of the people purported to be in the New Testament was there. Also, when Paul, his writings are reflected of what we see with the culture of the Essenes. So is John the Baptist. When Paul said, refrain yourself from touching women, but if you can't, just get married, that is more of an Essene teaching. That teaching was already existed. So when he said these notions included celibacy, we see that within the Essene community, which is a known Jewish community. So I don't think that should have been listed there, but I agree with the ritual suicide and the clitoral excision of girls at 8 days old. That is estranged from what we call Judaism or Israelite practices. Let's keep reading. Despite the first show of interest, Western Jews only started to show anything other than a vague and superficial interest in the Beta Israel once it became known they were being targeted by Christian missions. It could be well that during a period when Western Jews were increasingly being constructed as being black and having African blood, the last group in the world they wanted to have anything to do with was black African Jews. Let me stop here. If you read the first chapter, it talks about the color of the Jews, and it talks about the widespread notion that the Jews were seen as quite literally black and to have African blood. He opens the book with that. That's how they were looked upon. All right, so let's keep reading. At the time of the first European intervention in Ethiopia, it is important to note that the Beta Israel did not perceive themselves as Jews, Ayud and Gais. They thought of themselves as Israelites. In earlier periods, Ayud had been used as one of several derogatory designations of Beta Israel by the Christians, but the term was equally used to describe pagans or Christian heretics. It was never used by the Beta Israel of themselves. Joseph Halevi, 1827 to 1917, the Ottoman-born Jewish French Orientalist and traveler, most famous for his remarkable journeys into Yemen, and the first Western Jew to contact the Beta Israel, did not realize this when in 1867 he went to Ethiopia as an emissary of the Alliance Israelite Universal. He wrote of the first encounters. The crowd that surrounded me prevented me from entering into conversations with them, but I managed to ask them in a whisper, "Are you Jews?" They did not seem to understand my question, which I repeated in another form, "Are you Israelites?" A movement of assent mingled with astonishment proved to me that I had struck the right chord. Jacques Feitlovich, 1881-1955, who devoted his life to the cause of the Beta Israel, did much to perpetuate the construction of the Beta Israel as non-Ethiopian outsiders descended from a pre-Talmudic lost tribe of Israel that had found its way from ancient Israel to Ethiopia. This racial construction was accompanied by another racial construction that was at odds with the Beta Israel's account of themselves, the construction of the community as black. The color terms of Ethiopia include white for foreigners, Ferengi, red, gay, black, te a kor, and light brown, te ayim. The Beta Israel never considered themselves as the racially inferior, te a kor, but as K or te ayim. So they would call themselves red or light brown. If you were Tekor, the chances were that you were a slave. Feitlovich described the Beta Israel in quite different terms, both as Jews and blacks. They have kept the flag of Judaism flying in their country, he wrote, and can proudly proclaim we are black but calmly. Thus, from the 19th century, Beta Israel was constructed as black Jews and widely accepted as black Jews, and their blackness has underpinned most discussions of Beta Israel to this day. The intervening years have witnessed a transformation in this community. Once they utterly rejected the appellations Jew and Black, while now in Israel, where they are universally known as Ethiopian Jews and often as Black Jews, they have embraced them. As a result of European intervention and European construction, right from their beginnings, a new identity, a Black Jewish identity, has been imagined for the community, and in time were essentially absorbed by it. It was constructed in part because of the surprising oppositional and quixotic nature of the combined terms Jew and Black, which could be calculated to attract attention. From the standpoint of most white Jews, the most striking, noteworthy, and disturbing feature of the Beta Israel was not the purity of their religious observance, nor the precise modalities of their relation with Jewish history. It was their color. These disturbing associations and contradictions between the terms Black, African, and Jewish were soon addressed. Following the usual logic of the Hamitic hypothesis, Jewish features were discerned among the Beta Israel. Henry Aaron Stern, 1820-1885, a Jewish convert to Christianity who worked as a missionary to the Beta Israel in Ethiopia, observed of them. There were some whose Jewish features no one could have mistaken who had ever seen the descendants of Abraham either in London or Berlin. Their complexion is a shade paler than that of the Abyssinians, and in their eyes, although black and sparkling, are not so disproportionately large as those which characteristically mark the other occupants of the land. In other words, not only do these people follow Jewish customs and follow the Jewish faith, but also they look like Europeans, Ashkenazi Jews, before the visit of Joseph Halevi, and before anything much was known about the Beta Israel, there was a reassuring conviction on the part of some European Jews that in any event, the Beta Israel were not really black at all. Let me stop there and give commentary. Again, this goes with the belief that first, that these Ashkenazim are the real Jews. So anything that's going to be a Jew has to look like them. Edith Bruder opened that up in her book. She said, well, when I first saw these African Jews, I said, how could they be Jews? Look at them. She's saying they're Negro. Again, because we base everything from a surface level. We look at phenotype. Phenotype does not determine who you are related to. Because if a population is genetically diverse enough, they can create a multitude or a multiplicity of looks and phenotypes. So many of these early discoverers were erroneous in their thinking by judging these people based on what they thought was European features and saying, okay, we know they're Jews based on European features. No, it should be based off their history, their genealogy, what anthropology can show us, archaeology can show us, and nowadays genetics and what that can show us. All right, let's keep reading. It says, it was only some lowly members of the community, originally slave converts, who were of a darker hue. In other words, any true member of the community was a pale-skinned immigrant from elsewhere associated with other members of the Jewish faith by blood, facial structure, and skin tone. A member of the Beta Israel community who spent many years outside Ethiopia and who had internalized these external constructions of Beta Israel's appearance mentioned to a Western researcher that the community could recognize one another by their faces and particularly by their noses. Some foreign observers have by now discovered that the Beta Israel were dark-skinned. Because remember, when they were writing about them, they made everybody think that these people were white. Then they came to visit them, they was all dark. Why? Because they were pushing the notion of if they're Jews, we got to tell people they white. Because, well, the Jews we know are white. And that was very erroneous again. Check out my video and my breakdown on phenotypes does not matter here on the channel. Anyway, let's keep reading. Some foreign observers, having by now discovered that Israel was dark-skinned, thought that once they moved to a more temperate climate of the land of Israel, their skin color would soon revert to an appropriately Jewish off-white. Feitlovich, as a part of his general project to make the Beta Israel bona fide Jews, explained away their color by arguing that they had once been white, but their bodies were assimilated due to the heat of the burning Ethiopian sun, which had darkened the skin of these immigrants. And this goes into this temperate climatic theory, where wherever you move, that will influence how you look. That has been proven false. Cheddar Man lived in Europe. And his people lived in Europe for thousands of years. They were all of the dark, fine type. Many of them had dark skin. They were heavily melanated, so that has been proven false. You have the Abyssinian Negroes that has been living in the Caucasus, in Russia, right? And Abyssinia. They have been living there for thousands of years. We know they've been living there for thousands of years because Herodotus quoted and stated that there were Negroes there with woolly hair living in that region in the Cochian period and the Cochian area. And to this day, they still have Negroes there. Why haven't they turned white yet? Because the climatic theory was a bunch of racist hogwash BS. That's why. You're not going to move somewhere and magically become white or magically become black. How that happens is hybridization, gene shuffling, gene conversion. That's what happens when your mother and father get together, they reproduce, they made you, their genes all shuffled up and fused through meiosis. Through that process, they combine and create these different phenotypes and genotypes. You might have what's called imperfect penetrance when the recessive genes might express. That's what happens. Has nothing to do with magically being at one part of the continent versus another. Or a mutation might happen, a break in the code, an error in the code as it reproduces. One letter might not transpose correctly, and then that will express to be something else. And now your child might come out looking completely different than anybody in your family. That's why we have to get a strong grasp on the field of genetics. But let's get back into this. It says attempts to discover among the Beta Israel phenotypical features that distinguish them from other Ethiopians that are more or less Caucasian in nature and suggest that their skin color and shape of face are different from other Ethiopians continue unto modern times. In a hostile pre-review of my book, Operation Moses, the president of the American Association for Ethiopian Jewry, disputed my claim that the Beta Israel looked very much like other Ethiopians. He claimed that he had observed that a different degree of blackness of skin characterizes the Falasha from other Ethiopian tribes. They are less African and more Mediterranean than the others. They have less frequency of African-associated chromosomes. In other words, the same kind of process has been at work among the Beta Israel as pertained during the same period among many other constructed African groups from Guinea to Natal. This act of Jewish construction among the Beta Israel was also undertaken by a number of scholars. We now know that the origins of the Beta Israel do not lie early in the lost tribe of Dan or in the Jewish colony of Elephantine, or yet the wandering Karites, but rather in the evolution of a kind of Judaic-looking faith in Ethiopia that grew out of Ethiopian Christianity. Recent scholarship carried out by Ethiopianists and since about 1999 supported most unambiguously by genetics has produced a radically different perspective on their history, which denies their direct links to any ancient Jewish groups, dates their emergence as a separate people to the last 500 years, and places them firmly in the context of Ethiopian history and society. Now, let me mention that as well. What are they using as the source population or the reference frame? They're using Ashkenazium, those Jews, which many of them are R1b, by the way. Many of them have European paternal fathers and markers. They have R1b. R1b is a European clade. Most of Western Europeans have the paternal clade R1b. So using them as a frame is erroneous anyway. But that's for another discussion. It says this body of work, which inevitably has been seen as politically incorrect, given that the Beta Israel now in Israel have enough problems as it is, has shown that in fact there is no quote-unquote blood connection between Beta Israel and the Jews elsewhere. That a good deal of scholarly and publicistic writing continues to maintain along the lines of the Hamitic hypothesis, and despite a truly impressive lack of evidence that the Beta Israel were blood relatives of mainstream Jews. Now, what's funny about this is many of Ashkenazi and Sephardim are E3b. Many of these Ethiopians are E3b, E1b1b. So that would be a connection. But again, we have, I forget what it's called, but there's a bias in the field of genetics, population bias, I think it's called, where you say, well, these people, we know these people are such and such. So therefore, this is the frame that we accept. Anyway, it says the Beta Israel were blood relatives of mainstream Jews, that they were descended from Abraham, and their origins, therefore, were from outside the African continent. Can the Beta Israel reasonably function as a proof society for the world's black Jews and Israelites? Yes and no. Their historical experience cannot be employed to argue that Black Jews, wherever they are, descend biologically from the Israelites of old, but their historical experience could well be used to argue that for half a millennium, a kind of Israelitism was indeed practiced on African soil by indigenous Africans. That part you can't take away from them because that's been proven. They have a written history. They have the Keeper Nagas. You understand? We can see the Ethiopian unit in the New Testament being mentioned. We have Zephaniah 3 and 10 as well stating these things. Okay, the historical experience of another proof community, the Limba, has not little in common with the Beta Israel. Their traditional heartlands are the Mimberengwe, and Mposi area of Zimbabwe, and they are to be found today in small groups throughout northeast South Africa and in central and eastern Zimbabwe. For much of the 20th century, many Limba have claimed to be of Jewish or Semitic origin, and many European observers have made similar claims that them for an even longer period. The Limba claim to have come from Sina, which they placed across the sea somewhere in the north. The tradition of an origin far away outside Africa or in the remote northeast of the continent is found among very many African groups, and European support for and construction of such theories of extraneous origins clearly from part of the racial scheme embedded in the Hamitic hypothesis that was presented to and adopted by so many different African peoples. In the 1930s, one observer noted of the Limba, they are strongly suspected of being Semitic in origin. The reason for this belief are, amongst others, that they speak not Venda, as one would expect, but Karanga, obviously acquired during the sojourn farther north, and that their fathers, though of course dark, are distinctly non-Negro. They eat no pork, nor any animal which has not been kosher killed by slitting of the throat, and they do not intermarry with the house of their race, all such being called Washinzi, a word used along the East Coast for wild folk pagans. They live by barter only and used to be the best craftsmen in metalwork and pottery. Now, again, if you've been following the channel, you know that we talk about metallurgy, iron metallurgy coming from Southwest Asia. It says, it is also said that they were the first to introduce circumcision. At all events, Limba men certainly do often take a leading part in these rites. Much of the colonial travel and early ethnographic literature on the Limba suggests an extraneous origin for the tribe. However, a detailed study by A. Ruita, the senior curator of ethnography at the Museum of Human Sciences in Harare, categorically rejected any suggestion that the Limba came from outside of Africa or they were different from any other Zimbabweans. According to this paper, which contains a detailed review of the literature on the subject, the Limba are purely African, purely Zimbabwean, and that the idea that they came from elsewhere was invented by outsiders who created what we call a false Limba identity. Papers such as Rutawas could well have been written about many of the groups described in this book who are endowed with constructed identities, often through the paradigm of the Hamitic hypothesis as part of the symbiosis between Europeans and Africans in the colonial period. The reason that Ruita went to some lengths to try to demolish the idea that the Limba were foreign is connected to one of the great obsessions of the colonial period in southern Africa, the great Zimbabwe stone building civilization. Buildings such as the ones found in the area without close parallel in other parts of Africa, and the identity of the builders has been hotly contested. Claims were made from the first days of colonial intervention in this area that Limba outsiders had played a role in the construction of sophisticated stone building civilization. As white settlers moved into fertile lands north of Limpopo, they were astonished to find stone buildings, old mine workers, and most of all imposing great Zimbabwe ruins. One of the first white men to see these ruins was Karl Marx, 1837 to 1875, a German explorer and geologist who spent from 1865 to 1872 in almost continuous travel in little-known parts of Africa, hoping to make his fortune through his discovery of gold. Before Marx set off his journey, Alexander Marinsky, 1837 to 1918, a German missionary, told Marx that somewhere north of Limpopo River was a fabulous stone city, which he identified as the biblical Ophir. In 1868, Marx reported that he had found gold to the northwest of the Transvaal on the Tati River, which gave his rise to a short-lived gold rush. In 1871, guided there by a German explorer, hunter Adam Renders, 1837 to 1871, who had first laid eyes on the ruins in 1867, March came across the great Zimbabwe ruins. As he noted in his journal, always taking advantage of the tall grass, which unfortunately prevented a clear inspection of the area between the mountain and the Rundu, I crept into the interior of the latter and commenced drawing a rough sketch map. It seemed to him inconceivable that local people living in their simple abode huts could have ever been capable of building these majestic constructions. During his examination of the site, Mulch came across an undamaged wooden lintel, subsequently shown to have been made from African hardwood. That evening, he wrote in his diary, "It can be taken as a fact that the wood which we obtain is in fact cedar wood, and from this that cannot come from anywhere else but from Lebanon. Furthermore, only the Phoenicians could have brought it there. Further, Solomon used a lot of cedar wood for the building of the temple and all of his palaces, further, including here the visit of Queen Sheba, and considering Zimbabwe or Simboa, written in Arabic, of the Hebrew I understand nothing, one gets as the result that the great woman who built the Rundu could have been none other than Queen of Sheba," close quote. Immediately, with no scrap of evidence, Mulch declared that these ruins had been erected by Queen of Sheba and were in fact a copy of Solomon's temple and palace in Jerusalem, and that this entire area was Ophir in the Bible, Solomon's gold lands. In addition, the Queen of Sheba was in fact the Queen of Zimbabwe, and one of the wise men mentioned in the New Testament was also from this very place. Mulch's enthusiasm was entirely in the spirit of the time. Indeed, he simply followed the assumptions about Africa embedded in the Hamitic hypothesis that anything fine and sophisticated must have come from somewhere else. Unwittingly, he was also echoing earlier Arab and Portuguese accounts that maintained that the ruins had something to do with King Solomon. For the Arabs, Solomonic and other Judaic legends, some of which entered the Quran, were as much as conscripted in an explanation of strange places as were such legends for Western Christians. When the Portuguese first observed the East African coast, what is today Mozambique, they found a culture had been greatly influenced by the culture of Arab Muslims. At Great Zimbabwe, not altogether surprisingly, a range of important items at the site suggested strong links with the coast. What these items demonstrated was that the Great Zimbabwe was an important city whose wealth substantially connected to trade routes running down to the Indian Ocean. This was not, however, the broad conclusion reached by early British attempts to understand the Zimbabwe sites. The subtleties of the evidence was completely missed. The conclusion was immediately reached that the Zimbabwe civilization had been created by ancient Phoenicians or King Solomon. This fitted perfectly with the prevailing Hamitic hypothesis. In addition, this theory suggested that the British, as the heirs of the Judeo-Christian biblical tradition, and according to many at the time, direct biological heirs of the ancient Israelites, were indirectly more responsible for the wonders of the site, than the locals, or at least most of the locals. The archaeological efforts to prove this as quickly as possible succeeded in destroying the site, as valuable material was carted away and viewed as a decadence and filth of the Kafir occupation. The Zimbabwe ruins from the very beginning of the colonial period were universally considered to be beyond the capacities of black people. This discourse has persisted unto today. White Zimbabweans are often incapable of accepting the ruins were built by Africans. As one white woman exclaimed of the Shona people in general, they are baboons, they do not build anything, they destroy. The wildest theories were customarily put forth to explain the ruins, that they were built by visitors from outer space, by the Egyptians and so on. But even today, the preferred option is King Solomon and the Phoenicians. In the early days of the colonization of Rhodesia, a great deal then hung on these issues. It was in colonial interest to be able to prove that white supremacy was a fact and that subjugation of native peoples was legitimate. Moreover, if the country had once been controlled by a small maritime nation, the Phoenicians, why should it now be controlled by another small maritime nation, the British? Clearly, if traces could be found of these ancient colonizers, it would serve this particular historical vision. The Limba, with their Semitic-looking customs and apparently Judaic habits, who were to be found in the vicinity of the Zimbabwe ruins, were no doubt descended from those responsible for the ancient ruins and their new identification as Black Jews, who nonetheless had been white Jews before they denigrated, thus suited imperial needs. Not long after March had made this discovery, efforts were made to show that these once white Jews had in the past lived a great Zimbabwe and had been responsible for its creation. The Limba tribes were identified as Jews and defined in precisely the same way as so many other African tribes and groups had been before and since, and for similar reasons. Already in 1867, Limba people living in South Africa had been observed by the German missionaries Alexander Marinsky and Theodor Wangerman, 1818 to 1894, in the vicinity of Potgietersrus. Somewhat later in Rhodesia, the solicitor and journalist Richard Nicklin Hall, 1852 to 1914, wrote a book about the Great Zimbabwe, which he devoted considerable space to the Jewishness of the surrounding populations. He made a list of 24 supposed similarities of customs and belief and concluded additional parallelism with Jewish customs could be stated, and all these peculiar practices, together with lighter skin and Jewish appearances of the Makalanga, distinctly point to the ancient empress of Idumean Jews, which can also be traced to the present people of Madagascar and of the coast of Mozambique and Sofala. The Limba tribe of Makalanga is noted for the preservation and the observance of these Jewish practices, which are distinctly pre-Quranic in origin. So it has nothing to do with the Quran or Mohammedanism, but everything to do with Judaic cultic practices. Let's keep reading. In recent times, as prevailing attitudes about race in Africa have changed, the construction of the Limba as a Jewish and non-African community has taken on a politically incorrect character, much in the same way as the contrary presentation of the Beta Israel as an African people has taken on a politically incorrect coloring. It is true that white races until now have found that tradition of an extraneous origin of Limba extremely useful. In 1967, George Robert Gary, 1907 to 1996, the editor of the racist journal The Mankind Quarterly, wrote a short article followed by another 3 years later, and finally in 1972, a book in which he posited the connection of the Limba with what he took to be the very ancient stone building culture of Great Zimbabwe. He argued that the Limba had Jewish cultural and genetic traits, that their Armenoid genes must have been acquired from Judaized Sabians who had settled in the area thousands of years before, introducing more sophisticated technologies and culture to the region. One objective of his work was to show that the indigenous Shona people had never been capable of building in stone, of creating advanced social structures, as had obviously existed at Great Zimbabwe, or of governing themselves. However, there is no evidence that Judaized Sabians or any Middle Eastern people settled in the areas thousands of years before, and there's every evidence that the Great Zimbabwe was built something less than 1,000 years ago, over a considerable number of centuries by a local people. Gary's lines have been followed by contemporary white supremacy groups in the United States and elsewhere. In fact, that the Limba narrative has been associated with racist explanations of Africa has had one serious consequence, namely that few scholars have taken the issue of the Limba and the role they played in Great Zimbabwe civilization seriously. This was pointed out in the review in my book, Journey to the Vanished City, in 1997. The idea that the Limba were from the Middle East simply did not fit in, wrote the reviewer. With Mary Africa version of the Indigenous initiative and development that the Africanists propagated in the heady days of African nationalism 40 years ago. It looked too much like the racist or mystic paradigm of primitive earthlings living in ignorance until civilized aliens brought enlightenment. But the profession of African history is now much more self-confident, with the basic outlines of indigenous initiative and development well established. We should therefore positively welcome scholarship that seeks historical connections outside Africa, especially in Asia. In many respects, the modern identity of Limba seems to have been constructed by outside observers following the usual paradigms of Hamitic hypothesis. The Limba are physically similar to their African neighbors in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and to me, at any rate, all but indistinguishable from them. Members of the tribe display a wide degree of color variation, as do many other neighboring peoples. But in general, they are termed black, and their look, if one can generalize, is similar to that of other local groups. This did not prevent the travelers who ventured into Limba areas in the past, who thought of the Limbas as Jews or Semites, from expressing the conviction that the Limba had phenotypically traits that confirmed their racial origin, as others did with respect to Beta Israel. An English writer in 1880 spoke of the lighter skin and Jewish appearance of the Limba. Another 1893 described a group near Umyali who are, for the most part, tall and slim, with gentle and even dignified ways. Their skins are as dark as any other natives I have yet met with, but their noses are straight and not flattened out at the base like those of the true Ethiopian. Their lips, too, though broader than those of Europeans, are quite Caucasian when compared with the blubber excrescences carried about by the ordinary Zulu or Basuto. The Umyali boys have rather long, crinkly hair, very soft-looking, well-shaped eyes, and looking at their physiognomies as a whole and leaving out the question of color, it was easy to believe that they were descended from some scattered remnants of the great Hebrew race. Close quote. A. Jacques noted in 1931 that the whites of the northern Transvaal could distinguish a Limba by his features and observed many Limba had straight noses, rather fine features, and intelligent expression, which distinguished them from ordinary run of natives. One does occasionally meet with Limba who possesses strikingly Semitic features. One of my informants, old Mose, even had what might be termed a typical Jewish nose, a rare occurrence in any real Bantu. Some of the early ethnographic work on the Limba include profile photographs to establish that they did indeed have Jewish noses. In 1942, an article by Lewis Thompson, which included a profile photograph showing the Semitic features of the Limba, essentially a prominent nose, following the Hamitic hypothesis idea of the degeneration of such immigrant societies, noted, as the blood of Semite became more diluted with that of Bantu, so did their arts decrease. Being awarded a Jewish nose and Jewish feature had its disadvantages, as Howard Jacobson points out in Kaluki Nights. In the general European perception, big nose bad, small nose good. Constructed with Jewish noses, the Limba were also deemed to have other Jewish qualities, some good, some bad. On the one hand, as possessors of superior blood, Jewish was better than black. European look and Caucasian features, they were regularly put in a higher and more favored category than other tribes and were considered to be more trustworthy, more loyal, more hardworking, more intelligent than others. Let me ask the commentary there again. So a lot of these early writers were doing was, again, and superimposing European features on these groups that had Jewish customs to explain the Jewish customs. Well, if they got Jewish customs, then they got to look what we think a Jew looks like, which is European. So that's why they was, superimposing these things. Oh, they have to have Caucasian features, the nose. But Tudor Parfitt points out in his book that a lot of these people look indistinguishable from their African neighbors. So let's keep reading. It says the general racial classification in South Africa was a tripartite system of black, white, and colored. The Limba were never considered officially as colored, but they derived certain benefits in much the same way as did the colored people. It had been pointed out that while in such a system, colored, though they will never be white, benefit concretely from not being black. They also benefit from the existence of those who are. It should be also stressed that by being constructed as Jews, as they were in the first decades of the 20th century, they were being inserted into a highly ambiguous racial category. Jews may have been more or less white, but they were racially much less desirable than Nordics, Anglo-Saxons, or the English, and Jewish immigration was not encouraged on these racial grounds. In the mid-1920s, when the South African government was introducing an early version of the group areas, Southern African Jews were so acutely aware of their racial ambiguity that they were afraid they might find themselves defined as a special class with their own area. Whites in the region of the Transvaal in South Africa were no strangers to anti-Jewish prejudice and would obtain comments on the Limbas, money grubbing, on their sharp business skills, on their reluctance to spend unnecessarily, on their success, on their unusual number of Limba who had become university teachers, doctors, and lawyers viewed by them as Jewish professions. Some of these ideas were internalized by Limba themselves. In a South African compilation of vernacular accounts, M.M. Motenda, a Limba observed, the Vahalimba, in respect of their faces and noses, are well known to have been very handsome people. Their noses were exactly like those of Europeans. Plate 4 in this compilation showed a profile of a Limba with the prominent Semitic-looking nose. When I was doing fieldwork in a Limba village in Zimbabwe in 1987, I was urged to meet a man who everyone said was a typical Limba. He had a prominent nose, blue eyes, and what they said was a European face. They were very proud of this man's look, and I suspect that the important ritual roles he occupied were given on the strength of it. But in reality, he was the only Limba I met while I was in the Mimposi chieftainship in Zimbabwe who really had this kind of look. He was atypical, but presented as typical. The illustration in the ethnographic literature followed this principle. The Limba were constructed as Jews and were therefore expected to have look that corresponded to a Jewish stereotype. The Limba themselves are emphatic about looking Jewish. I love my people, a Limba woman told me in Soweto in 1989. We came from the Israelites, we came from Sinai, we crossed the sea. We were so beautiful with beautiful long Jewish noses and so proud of facial feature structure. We no way wanted to spoil our structure by carelessness, eating pig, or marrying non-Limba Gentiles. During fieldwork carried out in 2003, I discovered that in one Zimbabwe village, the majority of Limba respondents maintained that their Jewish noses were one of the most important things about them, one of the most important things in their lives. No matter that the outsiders usually commented on their paler skin, they were always unequivocally tagged as Black Jews. But this color designation certainly sits uneasily with the Limba's own views of themselves. If you ask a Limba villager who was Black around here, he will point at some Shona village far away over the hills and mutter, "Ah man, those Wasinzi people up there, they are Black." However, Limba frequently refer to themselves as Varungu Vakaba Sena, the white men who come from Sina, and frequently make fulsome allusions to the remarkable and attractive lightness of their own skin. My own engagement with the Limba, which started in 1987, resulted in a book that connected them with the Islamization and Arabization of the East Coast of Africa. There was no written records that indicated to me anything about their ultimate origins beyond the eastern coast of the African continent. The trial, as far as I was able to determine it, stopped at the Indian Ocean. There was similarly nothing to suggest that they were of Jewish origin, although there was a good deal to suggest that their religion they had practiced prior to the colonization of the areas in which they lived had much in common with the religion of ancient Israelites. Indeed, their religion, insofar as it was possible to reconstruct it, was not entirely dissimilar to the religion of the Beta Israel prior to their Judaization, and it was not dissimilar either to the various constructions of Israelite-type pre-colonial religions throughout Africa. Now, I gotta touch on that. So what he's saying, these Limba practices that clearly seem to be Jewish was not dissimilar from many of these Israelite-type pre-colonial religions throughout Africa. So you had these Jewish practices all throughout Africa, is what Parfitt is telling you. It says the Limba may have been connected with coastal civilizations based on a city called Sayuna by the medieval Arab geographers. After the coming of the Portuguese at the end of the 15th century, the Limba, now settled inland, far away from Islamic or other coastal influences, developed their identity and religious system independently of Islamic influence. By the time they were first described by Europeans, they had lost any strictly Islamic characteristics that they may possibly have had. There was no mention of Allah or of Muhammad, and they did not possess the Quran. Many aspects of tribal tradition suggested an appreciation, of the concept of separation of things, animals, people, which indeed may be taken as fundamentally Jewish principle. They observed a number of seemingly Semitic practices, endogamy, food taboos, such as refusal to eat with other groups, a refusal to eat animals that had not been ritually slaughtered, circumcision, which they may have introduced to Southern Africa, and menstrual seclusion, but many African communities had some, if not all, of these characteristics. So this Judaic practice was replete in Africa. You know why? You know, the strongest model I could give to why this is replete in Africa is because you had something called the Bantu expansion, which displaced many of the autochthonous African males in groups, the A and B groups, and you had a lot of these E markers come and dominate sub-Saharan Africa. That's why haplogroup E shares the lion's share of male paternal haplogroups in Africa to this day. Maybe that's why you have the similarities between all African traditions having these what we call Judaic or Judaic cultic practices. Let's keep reading. In 1996, a new unexpected tool of research came into play. Trevor Jenkins, a distinguished geneticist at Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, was introduced to the topic of the Limba through his friendship with the physicist Frank Nabarro, FRS 1916 to 2006, and his wife Margaret, an ethnomusicologist and a music teacher. Frank came from a well-known English Sephardi family. Margaret, however, was not Jewish but had converted. Margaret, perhaps marginalized in her relation with the South African Jewish community, as non-Orthodox convert, found a sphere of Jewish activity in which she could engage among the Limba, whose music she considered to have Jewish roots. Margaret introduced Trevor Jenkins to some of the community, giving him an account of what their history was and what claims had been made on their behalf. Jenkins was inspired to put Limba and outside commentators' claims to the test. For the first time in 1,000 years of construction of Jewish identity in Africa, and after countless claims of Jewish or Semitic ancestry with respect to myriad groups, it was possible to put the question of distant historical origins to an objective test. On the basis of the samples of DNA from 49 Limba men, Jenkins wrote what was a historic article, was published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, Volume 59, 1996. The results of the paper were that 50% of the Limba Y chromosome tested were Semitic in origin, 40% were Negroid, and the ancestry of the remainder could not be resolved, Jenkins noted. These Y-specific genetic findings are consistent with Limba oral tradition. Now, I want to make a note about that. We do that all the time here on the source. We test these oral traditions of many of these Bantu people or people that are EM2 or have these haplogroups. Let's look at their genetics. Can we see a migration? And we will see a migration. Like we keep bringing up Marjani's paper that was written in 2011. We can see the sub-Saharan African component in the Middle East and the Levant during the Iron 2A period before the 8th century BCE when the Israelites were there. We can see that. So then we can draw inference that these people have a historical connection with them. Same thing that what they used here. Keep reading. An analysis of the history of the Jewish people and their association with Africa indicates that historical facts are not incompatible with theories concerning the origin of the Limba. The following year witnessed the publication of a quite different genetic study. Based on number of Jewish groups worldwide, which would prove to be extremely useful, the study made use of 2 Y chromosome markers and constructed haplotypes for 188 male Jews, which showed that a specific haplotype was common among the hereditary Jewish priestly caste, the Kohanim, who, according to the Bible and Jewish traditions, are patrilineal descendants of the founder of the priestly clan, Aaron, the brother of Moses. The following year, another study extended the Y haplogroup to include 5 further markers, and this time Thomas et al. Found a more specific haplotype in the Kohanim, which they termed the Kohen model haplotype, or the CMH. The CMH is found in members of the Jewish priesthood, 56% and Sephardi Jews 45%, and Ashkenazi Jews between 3 and 5%, and general Jewish non-priestly families. The authors inferred from the date that the CMH was probably constituent of ancestral Jewish populations and calculated that this marker arose 106 generations ago at about the time of Moses, according to the biblical account. My own work on the Limba in 1980s and 1990s was disseminated quite widely. In addition to writing a book and a number of articles, I also did a series of BBC radio documentaries, which were broadcast on Radio 4 and also the World Service of BBC, which is beamed to Africa and often gets even into the villages in a television documentary that was broadcast by Channel 4, United Kingdom, and Nova PBS in the United States. Thus, my work, which included a reconstruction of Limba history, became quite well known to members of the Limba elite. Also, a few copies of my book were passed around from hand to hand and were read by many Limba in South Africa and Zimbabwe. Without knowing that Jenkins was about to publish his article, I had by 1996 independently come to the conclusion on the basis of historical and anthropological data that there may have been a connection between the Limba and the practically deserted town of Sina at the eastern end of Wadi Hadramaut Valley in the Yemen. I had the idea of comparing DNA collected from the eastern end of Wadi Hadramaut and Limba DNA. In 1997, Neil Bradman, the chairman of the Center of Genetic Anthropology at University College London, and I collected DNA in the Wadi Hadramaut, which was subsequently compared with a number of other populations. The ensuing paper, which analyzed 399 Y chromosomes in 6 populations, including the Limba, Bantu, and Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews, discovered that Limba Y chromosomes were divided into Semitic and Bantu clades, and that one of the Limba subclans, the Buba, which traditionally contained the Limba priesthood, to our surprise, carried the CMH at high frequency. The new genetic evidence seemed to take the conclusion of Jenkins a little further, as now there appeared to be a precise connection not only between the Limba and southern Arabia, which, given the close historic ties between the east coast of Africa and South Arabia, was not altogether surprising, but more specifically with ancient Jewish populations. Once again, the genetic findings seem to be consistent not only with some of the oral tradition of Limba, but also with the way in which the Limba has been constructed by outsiders. A recent genome-wide, as yet unpublished analysis of the Limba data suggests that some Limba, in fact, derived not from a South Arabian group, which is what was previously thought, but from a Levantine East Mediterranean population. How do they know that? Because they can see that these J markers or the CMH markers are within their population. So in order for them to have that within that population, there had to be an amalgamation event that happened in the past. And that's what the More Johnny paper shows you. That there was an amalgam between what we call these Jewish groups today and sub-Saharan Africans. In that land, we can see it is dated back to that period. They dated the microsatellites within the STR, the strong tandem repeats, and it dated before the 8th century BCE. All right. So they concluded that these people were obviously from the Levantine. As a result of these and other studies, it is now widely believed that the Limba are of Jewish origin and that this has a scientific basis. And this also includes, if we can show that the admixture happened between the sub-Saharan African element, which they used the Yoruba component to prove that in that paper, in More Judge's paper, then we know that they were there as well. And it's clear. We have plenty of evidence. And that gives the argument a scientific basis. This would also explain, this is my commentary, why the Bantu were bringing in Southwestern Asian material culture, such as bananas, coconuts, the humpback cattle, you understand, the chickens, the actual eating of chickens, the first place chickens to be commercialized and consumed is Palestine. It all comes together. It converges at this point. There's no way around it. The metallurgy, you understand? Their understanding of hydrology, their understanding of pyrotechnology, all of that was alien to sub-Saharan Africa. These people brought that in. We read that on the channel. I did a whole breakdown on the Bantu expansion. You can look it up on the channel where I go into further detail about that. And it also coincides with the fact that the Bantu expansion, most scholars agree that it happened around 3,000 years ago. You start seeing these major settlements about 300 in sub-Saharan Africa about 3,000 years ago. You understand? All of it lies together. And you also start to see what? Eurasian admixture in sub-Saharan Africa around 3,000 years ago. Come on, man. At some point, y'all got to bow down and kiss the ring. Let's get back into it. One word concludes, this research provides validation for the Limba, important news to the new worldwide Jewish community about their far-flung cousins, but it is equally fascinating for what it is. It tells everyone about race. This surprising genetic link between the tribe of Black Africans and their European and Middle Eastern cousins suggests that if there is a such thing as race, it isn't a matter of skin color or a prominent nose. I've been saying it on my channel. We're going to use race. Race, first of all, race means the etymology of the word race is talking about having common descent. That's what it originally meant. And now we use it to say common color. That don't make no sense. So if race do exist, it can't have anything to do with skin color or physical features. It has to deal with genetics. Let's keep going. Even though no official Jewish religious or Israeli authority has yet to determine that any specific DNA could affect the question of who is or who is not a Jew, a number of groups and many individuals throughout the world, and particularly in the United States, have taken the genetic research on the Limba as an indication that they are indeed Jewish and should be admitted as a matter of urgency into the family of Israel. To them, the DNA results appeared as a vindication of the efforts made by the Limba to have themselves recognized by other Jews as Jews. The results have been taken as a weapon against what such groups perceive to be racist and exclusive attitudes in Israel and among Jewry in general. Limba informants now insist that they have the same blood as Jews. This fact confirms for them what they had always said, that they were phenotypically different from their non-Limba neighbors. Those Limba with whom I have discussed the results often recall the fact that they habitually refer to themselves as the white men who come from Sina, and that the DNA evidence proves that they were once white and that they are Jews. Now, I have a problem with that. It doesn't prove that they were once white, but even if it did, it doesn't matter. But that doesn't in fact prove that. What it proves is you share the same markers. Some of them share the same markers as many of those modern Jewish groups. That's what it proves, meaning there was a admix event that happened in a time past. And like I said, all this stuff adds up to the Bantu expansion 3,000 years ago, the Eurasian admixture going 3,000 years ago, the settlements going into sub-Saharan Africa popping up 3,000 years ago. So it becomes a culmination and they all converge. Let's keep reading. It says the worldwide mass of interest in these findings has suggested that the Limba DNA results are becoming evidentiary ground on which historical claims are made plausible or implausible, cultural, religious, and political practices are made possible, and disputes are adjudicated. Indeed, genetic results are now considered evidentiary ground by many people, and it could be well be that in the future such results will be included in Israel's criteria for immigration purposes, which might lead to general recognition of groups like the Limba by Jews. Elizabeth Povinelli has suggested that the politics of recognition presupposes an archive. It has been proposed that the genetic historical archive may prove to be, or in the writer's articulation, may prove to have been essentially to the hope of self-described lost tribes to be recognized by the mainstream of the Jewish world and by the Israeli state as potential Jews. For the Limba themselves, as genetic results had particular value, quite simply because Orthodox sources and archives were unable to prove that their own cherished narratives of origin were true. They have been ridiculed and belittled, particularly by Southern African Jews, because their oral traditions seem fanciful and unhistoric. Now they have what they regard as proof of the authenticity of their traditions. The outside interest in this genetic research on the Limba derives mainly from the fact that DNA helps to prove a theory about which historians and other scholars had severe reservations. For many people, the Limba claims prior to genetic findings seem too far-fetched to be true. And indeed, geneticists and those who reported their activities almost invented the Limba as a Jewish community for outsiders. For the Limba elite, the DNA evidence had further usefulness. As a result, the Limba leadership was increasingly drawn into a wide range of Jewish and other networks in South Africa and the United States that were closed to them before, and indeed, now it can be stated with a considerable degree of certainty that the genetic findings will have an overwhelming impact upon the future narratives of the Limba community, upon their sense where they belong, and indeed upon the way in which the community is regarded by other people. Now, again, this is my commentary again. Again, this commentary shows, this genetic evidence shows that they had admixed events with these people that you accept as Jews. That would mean, if we know that those J markers start going into Levant around the Bronze Age, that would mean that you would have Bantus admixed with them in the Bronze Age, and that's why I keep referencing Morjani. That would put them in that area. That's the beauty of this admixture, because again, they dated these haplogroups to that time, to the Bronze Age period, and then going into the Iron Age period. It says, despite the positive aspect, the whole issue sometimes is taken as politically incorrect, since the Holocaust and the grotesque representation of Jewish physicality in Nazi and other propaganda, great efforts have been made to deconstruct Jews as a race. There can hardly be a more sensitive topic than the construction of Jewish biological difference. Indeed, Orthodox anthropology and international efforts spearheaded by UNESCO through the medium of its 4 statements on race between 1950 and 1967 have insisted that there are no biological differences between peoples. To anyone with a knowledge of how Jews have suffered at the hands of the false race sciences of recent times, any suggestion that Jews possess specific biological features appears in itself to be racist. Yet, paradoxically, genetic findings, while purporting to prove that races do not exist, seem also to be proposing bodily and stride markers common to Jews. To some people, this is perplexing, to others downright offensive. Whether indeed a genetic signature conveys Jewishness in any meaningful sense is a complex topic. The Israeli geneticist Karl Skorecki has said, being Jewish is a spiritual metaphysical state, and DNA is a physical characteristic. We're not going to determine who is Jewish by the sequence of their DNA. Now, let me stop right here. It's so funny. As soon as we got these black people with these markers, now y'all have a problem with physical characteristics. But this whole book, they pointed out that a lot of these people were judging people based off of their physical characteristics. So I just found that hilarious and paradoxical and hypocritical. And Tudor Parfitt is going to rebut Mr. Karl Skorecki, the Israel geneticist. Watch what he says on the being Jewish is spiritual and metaphysical. If that's the case, then it would be no issue with anybody with blacks claiming to be Jews, period. That's one. You wouldn't say anything. Oh, well, they're spiritually and metaphysically Jews. Okay. That never been the case. But watch this. But is being Jewish a spiritual metaphysical state? If it's true, it is only partially true. A Jew essentially is someone born of a Jewish mother. Boom. That rebutted everything that geneticists just said. You saying that being a Jew had nothing to do with DNA, but you guys go around pushing and advocating in your law in the halakha that you are a Jew if only if you're born of a Jewish mother. That's a physical thing, not a metaphysical thing. So again, that was a hypocritical statement made by this man. The only reason you're making this statement because you don't like these quote-unquote black people claiming a Jewish lineage. It's evident. Let's keep reading. So, Tudor Parfitt was on his bump on that. And he pretty much refuted and rebutted him with that. Because if you're saying that it's all metaphysical and spiritual, then why do you guys say you can only be a Jew if you're born of a Jewish mother? It's that simple. That's a cut. It says a Jew essentially is someone born of a Jewish mother, and that is obviously a physical characteristic. In any event, for the Limba, their sense of Jewishness has little to do with spiritual matters. For them, it is a question of birth, blood, and a question of what they perceive as their Jewish culture. Most Limba were converted to Christianity in the early years of colonization when efforts were made to stamp out their ancestral faith. Listen to this part, bro. Listen to this part, family. Listen to what they're about to say. These Christian missionaries were trying to convert them to stamp out their ancestral faith. And you're going to hear what they were trying to do. They were trying to purposely make them break their traditions. Watch this. Limba children, for instance, were offered places in mission schools, but on condition that they ate pork and attended church. They made these kids, if they wanted to go to them schools, they would have to eat pork, break their damn tradition, and attend their Christian church. They were forcing these people to break their traditions, to try to stamp out their ancestral faith. Let's keep reading. Today, the religious life of the Limba is highly syncretistic. Many of them belong to the various Christian churches, for example, the Zion Christian Church and Pentecostal groups, whereas a few in Zimbabwe are Muslims. Some Limba, however, claim to be Limba by religious practice as well as by ethnic identification. Although despite the long periods I have spent living with the Limba, particularly in Zimbabwe, I had never been permitted to witness much in the way of their traditional practices. However, Zimbabwe elders have recently invited me, I think uniquely, to accept the traditional circumcision and thereby become a Limba, which would, should I embark upon this hazardous project, enable me to study their secret prayers and songs. The religious practice of these Limba probably does not have very much in common with Judaism as it is practiced elsewhere. Moreover, many of the Limba who perceive themselves as ethnically Jewish find no contradictions in regularly attending Christian church. Indeed, by and large, the Limba who are most stridently Jewish are often those with the closest Christian attachments. The Limba Muslims I have interviewed were more reticent about their Israelite origins. More Limba see absolutely no contradiction in being Christian and Jewish. So again, Garfield posed on this question, posed on his channel, show me a group of Jews that were Christian or believed in Christ. And we had that with the Limba, we had that with the Ethiopians for thousands of years. You had the Christian elites believing to be Israelites and following Christianity. So that was a dumb statement on his behalf. Let me keep reading. It says, certainly Judaism and Christianity rarely seen incompatible. And that, you know what, that's a crazy statement. I'm sorry, I'm gonna read on, but that's a crazy statement to say, because when you open up the New Testament, the people that are pushing Christianity, the pioneers of Christianity, are Jews. They're Jews. That whole community were Jews, and we got history about up to 5 centuries of them Jews continuing on and teaching. Then we have like the Ethiopians that were Jews and teaching Christianity. So it's like, that comment was just bananas, and it made no sense. And it showed that Garfield is a very unlearned individual, and he's a dilettante. He lacks knowledge and he lacks commitment to the study. He doesn't care about the information, so he's not going to study it. Let's get back to this. Former Liberian President Charles Taylor, who was awaiting judgment in the Hague for alleged crimes against humanity has recently decided to convert to Judaism. Taylor's wife, Victoria Taylor, told BBC Radio that the former warlord, the first African dictator to appear before the International Tribunal, has decided to become a Jew, and he wants to follow the true religion according to him. He wants to know deeply about God. According to his wife, Taylor discovered Judaism after being put on trial. When he got to The Hague, he got to know that he really wanted to be a Jew, and he wanted to convert to Judaism, and that's what he has done. He wants to know deeply about God and all about creation, and he wants to serve God accordingly and immediately. Taylor's wife said that he still believes in Christ and hopes to embrace both religions simultaneously. He wants to follow the two religions, she told the BBC. For the Limba, the impact of various genetic tests has been considerable and has had the effect of bolstering their sense of being Jewish and encouraging some of their numbers to embrace mainstream Judaism. For the Limba, the results appear to confirm their ancient traditions and prove that their male ancestors were Jews. Indeed, this is a reasonable interpretation of the data. So, again, Tudor Parfitt saying this is reasonable interpretation of the data. These are his words. Shay J. D. Cohen, now the literature professor of Hebrew literature and philosophy at Harvard University, has been dismissive of the genetic anthropological project. As a historian, he has said, I find the whole enterprise rather silly. Are the Limba descendants of the lost tribes who disappeared from the face of the earth? The answer, of course, is no. They might well be, however, a kind of modern lost tribe, a group of people unbeknownst to us and to themselves carrying Jewish genetic material. According to Cohen, the Limba will be accepted as Jews not as a result of their own practices or as a result of genetic markers, but rather if and when the Jewish people want them to become Jews, and that's the way it's been since Moses and Aaron. So this guy's so arrogant, Shay J.D. Cohen, and I have one of his books, by the way, that he's saying, well, we're not going to accept them as Jews until we're ready to accept them as Jews. Like, that is crazy. So we're not looking at, if they descend from anybody. It's all about, well, your authoritative position, and I determine exactly who is Jews. So it's not based off evidence. It's based off what you say, which is just crazy. I read that, I'm like, that's a crazy statement to say, but that just lets you know the mindset of some people. Let me keep reading. There are a number of things fundamentally wrong with this formulation. And again, Tudor Parfitt reprimands him. Phenomenologically, Judaism, except in the biological sense of being descended from Jews, is a free-floating entity like an ideology, religious or otherwise. The very many Jewish and Israelite groups in the world who may by now outnumber mainstream Jews do not need the permission or authorization of the mainstream Jewish people to consider themselves as Jews or to be Jews. So Tudor Parfitt just cut this man to the heart. Like, listen, Shane, they don't need your permission to claim this lineage. What the hell wrong with you, man? Let's keep reading. The consent of the Jewish people is only relevant to more limited concern or their being accepted by them as Jews. Historically, a number of adoptions of Judaism or Israelitism from the Himyarites to the Beta Israel have not come about because the Jewish people so wished it. Anyone is free to adopt an ideology and call it in himself or herself whatsoever he or she pleases. It is simply the nature of ideologies. These days, the key acceptance by the world Jewry is the state of Israel, whose policy on immigration and on the status in Jewish terms of such groups as the Limba, B'nai Menashe of India, or indeed the Beta Israel is highly pragmatic. But the acceptance as Jews by the state of Israel does not in of itself make such groups Jewish or more Jewish in any meaningful phenomenological sense. Time will tell whether genetic markers will one day be taken as criteria for determining eligibility for the purposes of Israeli immigration. There are signs that they will. Quite apart from immigration issues, the general topic of Jews and genetics is problematic. The issue of Limba and genetics is no less so. Nadine Epstein, a Washington-based writer, argued in Hadassah magazine and organ of the Women's Zionist Organization in America that Though in the beginning she was troubled by the idea of genetic elite among Jews who could trace themselves back to Abraham, Moses, thanks to their Y chromosome, she concluded that the positive aspects of this sort of research far outweighed the possible negative outcomes. She declared that the study provided a good tool for the reconstruction of Jewish history. As she put it, there is no hiding from DNA research. It is one of the forces of our time. And that's why we use DNA to make our arguments. You can't hide from that. That's a scientific basis. That shows who we descend from or our genetic material being in other lands or other places during the said historical time, which is in question, like the sub-Saharan African element that we see thanks to More Johnny, going back to ancient Levant during the time of the Israelites. It says, others have found that the Limba DNA results dazzling and a proof that Judaism crosses all races. And that's the thing. When you look at, we read Mutazes Ibrahim's work, and I might read his work live. He talks about many of these genotypes cut across what we call races. So you're like, oh, this is the African race, this is the European race. Well, if you look at these different genotypes and different haplotypes, they cut across that. Meaning you'll have someone like the Chadic people. They have R1b paternal markers, which is a predominantly Western European genetic marker, paternal clade. And they look sub-Saharan African. You understand? And then you have some of the Berbers that may have African haplogroups, but they look quote-unquote European. Proven again, you can't judge what someone is genetically and genealogically solely on how they look. Let's keep reading. It says, without doubt, the genetic results and their dissemination through television, films, radio, newspaper articles, and books have complicated the ethnic identity of the Limba. The DNA research and worldwide puzzlement and controversy it has provoked have contributed to the centuries-old debate. The newsworthiness of the topic is embedded in Giordano Bruno's conviction that Jews cannot be black. But the research has also spoken to millions of people, black and white, who believe that Jews can be black, and others who believe that in some sense all Jews are black. The tension between these various perspectives now resonates with the unfashionable ideas of the bodily and striped Jewishness, which is perceived as being in the DNA, but which transcends black and white color categories. And if you know anything about DNA and haplogroups, they do transcend that. I even showed a particular family. Many of his paternal fathers all look white European, but they have a sub-Saharan African haplogroup, EM2, which many other African American males have. Like I said, it cut across those race categories, letting you know these racial categories are false. They're fictitious. They're fictive in nature. They don't exist. Let's keep reading. And part this is because the media interpret genetic results in an exaggerated way and give the impression that DNA sequence is significantly more than just a more or less meaningless sequence. In this sense, the Jewishness of the Limba may be seen as a 21st century genetic construction. Nonetheless, in the case of the Limba, the age-old question of can a Jew be black or can a black be a Jew have been answered with a forceful response. The black Limba, the white man who came from Sina with their bodily inscribed genetic history that ties them with the Middle East, now serve for many aspiring black Jewish groups throughout the world as the one black Jewish proof community whose authenticity, in their view, is based on the most unassailable scientific proof of all. It is most unlikely that this would change. So again, what does unassailable mean? It can't be attacked. You can't attack DNA. It's just there. It's empirical. We can observe it. It's unassailable scientific proof. And this is why I said he ended this book on a bombshell, man. That's why I tell y'all ain't read this book. Hey, y'all see us knocking at the door. Let the readers in. Let's go. Edward Wilmot Blyden, 1832-1912, the great American librarian, writer, diplomat, and politician, noted that the great body of the Dark Continent has been apparently overlooked by the Jews. There is not, to my knowledge, a single synagogue in West Africa along the 3,000 miles of the coast. Probably not 24 representatives of God's chosen people in that whole extent of the country. Not a Jewish institution of any kind either for commercial, religious, or educational purposes. Have the Jews no witness to bear in the intertropical Africa? Today, he will be astonished in Africa, and Ghana, and Ivory Coast, and Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, and Cameroon, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, and Uganda, and Kenya, and Kenya, and Malawi, and Cape Verde, and Ethiopia, and Somalia, and Zambia, and around the Great Lakes and Congo. Various groups have been constructed or have emerged into being for a wide range of historical reasons, and now form a part of a differentiated cultures which are increasingly linked one with another. In the United States, Israel, Africa, and elsewhere, including Papua New Guinea, where there are altogether millions of adherents of some other aspect of Black Israelism. Groups that exist increasingly consider themselves, and may be considered by others, as completely legitimate transnational Black Hebrew Israelite community with increasingly strong links with other sections of the Jewish world. And that is the end of Tudor Parfitt's book, and that's the statement he left it on. So who said Israel ain't got reach, man? We all over. You see us knocking at the door. Let the readers in. And that, family, is Tudor Parfitt's book, Black Jews in Africa and the Americas. We completed the entire book from the preface, the introduction, all the way to chapter 9. We can clearly see how it concluded. All right. So I believe he ended that book very, very strongly. Very strongly. Hey, shout out to Elder Uriah in the building, man. What's cracking? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. The book did mention how to. Yeah. That was fire. I get excited when I read the book. That was fire how he ended that book, man. I love the end of it. The way he led up to it and everything. If you read the whole book and the progression all the way, then you get to the end of it. The legitimacy, the genetic argument, and how he was like, yeah, this argument is solid. It's unassailable. Hey, man, I got to drop some bombs for Tudor Parfitt, man. Hey, much love to Tudor Parfitt. I appreciate that professor for dedicating his time and his life to actually, unveiling these things and pushing that genetic research the way he did, and the connections he saw, and giving the Limba a voice on the international level, man. But the way he ended that book was fire, man. Had to drop some bombs for Tudor Parfitt, man. Had to. That's a must do, man. Source Gang, 7 gang over everything. You know how we doing. Are you not entertained? Not entertained! All right, we're going to wrap it up. It's been a long journey from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 9. You know what I'm saying? Shout out to Wesley Curry. I've been seeing you a lot. Shout out to Game Amp Me. Shout out to Second Exodus. Shout out to all the family that came in and watched all the way to the end. Shout out to my brother James Cassell, swinging and banging all the way from Atlantic Canaan. You know how we get it. We from Texas. We know how we do. Yeah, man, it's pretty much a body bag at this point. You got to actually read. You actually have to read. Yeah, man. Yeah. Second Exodus said Leo Africanus states that the Falasha are Hamites practicing Judaism and are converts, but you have to understand the genetic matrix. Some of them are A, some of them are E3B. You have a small percentage of the EM2, so they're not all the same. Excuse me. And I would say those that are haplogroup A would be, Hamites. You know what I'm saying? And even with those that have J markers, I would say they're Japhetic. But what that proves is that the Limba admix with Middle Easterners. And we got other evidence that proves that happened. We can see Eurasian admixture coming in into sub-Saharan Africa 3,000 years ago. That's been proven. Around the same time of the Bantu expansion. All right, let me see if I can meaningful. Second Exodus. I see y'all was getting busy in the comments, man. Y'all left like 68 comments. Second Exodus said, yes, this book has good source material. Yeah, many of these sources he's pulling directly from and bringing out are heavy hitters, man. And they're not his words, it's sources from those times, and he's giving his commentary and his opinion about it. You know what I'm saying? And if you didn't know nobody, you wouldn't think that the book was taking the route that it took when you get to the end. Oh, word, I ain't heard of that. Hebrew was found in the Zimbabwe and the stones. I mean, you got to share that. I'm not knowledgeable in that area. I didn't know that. Game Amp Me, she said, them Westerners, their categories and instrumental separatist tactics and observation. Yeah, racial theory is a very separatist tactic, and it's flawed. It's not scientifically sound. It's based off of racism. It's based off of the curse of Cain, and all black people are the same, and they're the same because they're cursed. You know what I'm saying? That's where it came from. Ida Bruder touches on that on her book as well. Hey, brother, love you too, man. R.W. Smith said, love y'all for real, man. Love you too, man. I'm here for y'all. Game Amp Me says, Yemen is directly across the sea from the Horn of Africa, aka Ethiopia, Shema Israel. Exactly. It is. It is. Carl Mill says, Low Country, South Carolina, all brothers are called Booba. Everywhere in Low Country, if you are black, you're Booba instead of brother. Oh, for real? Word. I didn't even know that. Kevin J. I don't know who Kevin J is. Is that Kevin the Christian? Hey, R.W. Smith, subscribe to the channel, like, share the video to the various social media platforms as well. And get it out there. You will be satisfied here at this channel because I'm going to continue to bring historical content and bring out these books. The next book we're going to tackle after we finish Edith Bruder's book I have in my hand, The Black Jews of Africa, History, Religion, and Identity. After we finish her book, we're going to move on to the West African slave owners, because there's a myth going on in the Israelite community that they believe that if you sell slaves, own slaves, trade slaves, then you're not of the same people. Garfield said that madness the other day. Why would they sell their own people? You obviously don't understand the history of West African slave trading, but that's what we're here for. You see us knocking at the door. Let the readers in. No, Kevin, I called you Christian because I don't know. Are you the Kevin that used to be with us back in the day on Google Hangouts? I'm not sure if that's you. So when I said the Christian, I'm like, is that the brother that will be with G Con them? You know what I'm saying? Shout out to G Con, by the way. Yeah, the homie was big into slavery. The Oyo State was big into slavery. The Bihogos were big into slavery. That was selling a lot of the Luso Africans, by the way. They were in the slave trade. They owned slaves. They had slaves on their plantation. They had house servants. They had all that. And we're going to bring that out in our book, The West African Slave Owners. Matter of fact, should I give a preview for that before we close out? Let me see. Let me see if I can get that. Yeah, that's gonna be the next one we do. You know, me and Jeremiah gonna be doing it. He got the book, The West African Slave Owners. Slave Owners of West Africa. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen so you guys can see. We'll read the preview. Oh, so this is a different Kevin. My bad, Kevin J. That's why I was trying to clarify, man. That's why I meant by Christian, man. Welcome to the channel. Hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel. You will not be dissatisfied. I will continue to feed you guys with historical content. We cover books here. We cover a range of topics that deal with, history in general. And don't always have to be about the Bible. So, yeah, we do that here. Welcome, brother. Now watch this. I'm gonna share the screen and give y'all a little quick preview on what me and Jeremiah, please say to Yah, is going to be covering on the channel soon. It's this book here, Slave Owners of West Africa, Decision Making in the Age of Abolition. It says, in this groundbreaking book, I'm going to read this to you real quick. In this groundbreaking book, Sandra E. Green explores the lives of 3 prominent West African slave owners during the Age of Abolition. These first published biographies reveal personal and political accomplishments and concerns, economic interests, religious beliefs, and responses to colonial rule in an attempt to understand why the subjects reacted to the demise of slavery as they did. Green emphasizes the notion that the decisions made by these individuals were deeply influenced by their personalities, desires to protect their economic and social status, and their insecurities and sympathies for wives, friends, and other associates. Knowing why these individuals and so many others in West Africa made the decisions they did, Green continues, is critical to understanding how and why the institution of indigenous slavery continues to influence social relations in West Africa to this day. So you guys are going to get this book in its entirety on the channel. We're going to give our commentary. We're doing it for scholarship and research purposes, so we're covered by the Fair Use Act, Section 107 of the Copyright Law. And you guys are going to learn about these slave owners in West Africa, because there's a myth going around that this wasn't happening. They had plantation, they had slaves on their plantation. And then in Peter Mark's books, he brings out that the punishment for one African tribe, I can't think of the name now, well, a witchcraft. They found you doing witchcraft, they would enslave you. So what they would do was they would have a vested interest in your court decision. They'll go to court, they'll go to your trial and see if you were guilty so they can buy you as a slave. That's in Peter Mark's book. So you did have various West African groups involved in the slave trade that was buying and trading slaves. For instance, the Bihogos, they would snatch up all type of Africans. They would snatch up from their own. They would snatch out other African tribes, the Luso Africans, and they would sell them to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese would sell them into their colonies in America, mainly Brazil. That's historical. That's written in history. So that's a quick preview on that. But, you know, I just want to give my condolences and my praises to Tudor Parfitt for great work on his book. We will be in the future sometime dealing with his other book, Hybrid Hate, which is another banger, you know what I'm saying, full with bombs. That book is filled with bombs, man. Like, great book, man. Great book to read and study. If y'all haven't read that, I advise you guys to read that on your own, but I will eventually cover that book as well on the channel. You know what I'm saying? So with that being said, like Tudor Parfitt brought out, man, that many of these groups in Africa have these Jewish faith and identification, and that's here to stay. And with the Limba, it made it unassailable. Can't even attack it. It has a scientific basis now. All right, so with that, let's close out the show. You know what I'm saying? Let's close out with Jeremiah, man. We'll do the final show. Closing out with my brother Jeremiah. Let's see if I can find a video. And, you know what I'm saying, I want to thank everybody that, you know, followed me from chapter 1, the introduction, the preface, all the way to the very end of the book. Stay on the lookout. I am going to complete Ida Bruder's book next. We got one more part to finish her book. It's going to be, I believe, chapter 7, or is it chapter 8, 9, and 10? Yeah, chapter 8, 9, and 10 in the epilogue, all in one video. You know, it's going to take us 3 or 4 hours, but, you know, bear with us. We'll be dropping that next. All right. So from there, let's go ahead and close out. Right now, I'm looking for Jeremiah's music. He shot a new video in Houston, by the way, throwing up the 4. We will be premiering that on the channel as well.
Greetings.
All right.
Greetings.
We're going to end with Jeremiah's blessing. You know what I'm saying? You see us knocking at the door. Let the readers in. You see who collegiate. You see who actually studying, who's studious, man. It ain't you, brothers. It's us. The source. Source gang, 7 gang over everything. Let's get it. No, I'm rocking, man. Let's go.
See you all. I've been sent here to do great things, amazing things, beautiful things, positive things, blessing things, healing things, loving things, happy things, for the rebuilding of the new world, the blessing of the world, to build the kingdom here of the Most High God here on earth. Blessings to you, sending you love and positive vibrations around the world. Blessings to you, and welcome.
Most motivation, start with devastation. You must fall before you rise. They want a demonstration. I'm here to get it all. Right before I spend it all, the elder need to come and see the youth. They need to get involved. I want the finer things, in love with shiny things, descended from black royalty, so you can blame my veins. I just call it blessings. I got the right perspective. If I see myself going off, I'm just gonna change direction. I love the brotherhood with all the flaws of brotherhood. I ain't gotta say a damn word and know it's understood. Yeah, we make mistakes, but that's what makes us great. Learn how to accept apology without acting fake. I know the pot is hot because you're grudge bearing. A lot of niggas going blind because their sun is staring. They on a mission to dim the light, we call it tail bearing. The law said thou should not covet, but he's still staring. And now I'm mortified with all the sins that multiply. Got your brother crying at the wall like a Mordecai. I'm really horrified. A lot of brothers are feminized. They really start to bug my damn nerves. I use pesticide.
Unlearn, relearn, and apply. Get your blessings from the Most High. Matthew 7:7, seek and you shall find. If you knock, it shall be open wide. Blessings. Hey, get your blessings. Hey, Deuteronomy 28:2-3. All these blessings shall come upon thee. All these blessings shall overtake thee. Get your blessings, hearken unto thee. Blessed shall thou be in the field. Blessed shall thou be in the city.
I push a Range Rover until the rain's over. Dying from an overdose. I hate that he can't stay sober. But it's not the car, it's my spirit, man. Claiming that he show brotherly love, but he never does. There's no greater wealth than your family's health. Gather all the negativity and put it on the shelf. And it's nothing wrong when you have success. A father leave inheritance to his children, that man is blessed.
Unlearn, relearn, and apply. Get your blessings from the Most High. Matthew 7:7, seek and you shall find. If you knock, it shall be open wide. Blessings. Hey, get your blessings. Hey, Deuteronomy 28:2-3. All these blessings shall come upon thee. All these blessings shall overtake thee. Get your blessings, hearken unto thee. Blessed shall thou be in the field. Blessed shall thou be in the city.
Yep. And that's it, man. That's it, man. Shalom to the family. Shalom to everybody that came through. Shalom, Bellet. Shalom, Scott, Garrett Headley. Shalom, Jerry Mon. Game App Me. Shalom, sister. And blessings. You're right. That's right. Shout out to Jeremiah. Fire musician, fire rapper. Nah, we do it, man. You know, we rocking, man. You see us knocking at the door. Let the readers in. Source gang, 7 gang over everything, man. You know what I'm saying? 7 candlesticks up, and I've been telling y'all, it ain't a debate. It's a stick up. Gang!